चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 छैया.
Okay, in this second video on income statements, we're going to wrap up by taking a look at a couple of years of income statements and seeing what kind of things we can infer, what we can see about the company. So as we look at these 2 years, the first thing we notice in the sales, the top line, is that it's growing. So that is normally a good thing. It's a desirable thing. In this case, sales went from 3.4 million to 5.8. Not quite a double, but a pretty significant jump. It was more than $2.4 million increase in sales. So that sounds really exciting. As we move down, though, we see some other maybe more concerning things. The first one being the cost of goods sold. That was 2.8 million. Now our cost of goods sold is 4.9 million, so it's gone up by a little more than 2.1 million. So there's been a very large increase in the cost of goods sold, and in a minute we'll see that the proportion is bigger than the proportional increase in sales. As we look at some other things, the other expenses went from 340 to 720. That's more than doubled. So that expense grew by a great deal, and then depreciation as well jumped considerably. It's not quite 7 or 8 times bigger than it was before, not quite 10 times bigger, but a huge difference in the depreciation. And so overall, the operating costs have increased dramatically by about $2.6 million. And so the net result is our EBIT is lower. And when you couple that with moving down a line, the interest expense is almost tripled. We have a big difference in terms of the pre-tax earnings, and ultimately the bottom line is quite a bit lower. So it's not only about the sales growth, that we also care about the margins. That's the difference between the sales and the expenses, and we ultimately care about the bottom line, the net income. So in this case, there's some a lot of things going on, and we should kind of dig into that. And so what I want to do, and what you'd want to do anytime you're analyzing income statement, the balance sheet, is kind of dig into the numbers, start to analyze those numbers. And so what we're going to do is use a tool that's much more suited for that as opposed to this PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to jump over to Excel real quick. And we're going to take a look at these things. So one thing I could do in terms of looking at the changes is just take the difference of these two cells. So if I say 2018 minus 2017, I can see that my sales grew again by about $2.4 million. If I copy that cell down, or that formula down, my expenses, or my cost of goods sold I should say, grew by 2.1 million. My other expenses grew by 380,000. Depreciation grew by almost 100,000. Total expenses grew by 2.6 million about, and my EBIT is down almost 200,000. So again, looking at these differences, I can just continue going all the way down here, and my bottom line, my net income, is $183,000 worse off than we were last year. So in this case, the growth was not necessarily a good thing. Hopefully in future years, perhaps we were laying some groundwork this year. In future years, we can continue to grow our top line and not have the expenses growing at the same rapid clip. But in this case, if we're just looking at these 2 years, the growth came at a pretty serious cost. But let me show you, I think there's a better way of looking at the changes here, and that is looking at the percentage change. So in this column, I'm going to go ahead and do a percentage change calculation. And what I'm going to do here is just take this cell, divide it by this cell, and then take away 1. So we're going to be left with a percentage if I format it that way. And so in this case, sales grew by 70%. Again, that's an exciting number. But when we start to look at some of these other things, we're going to have some issues. Our cost of goods sold grew by almost 74%. So it's growing at a faster rate than our sales, and that's never a good thing. Well, I shouldn't say never. That by itself is not a very encouraging thing. Perhaps there's a reason for that. Maybe some one-time charges. We're building in some efficiencies over time, and that can start to go down. That cost of goods sold as a percentage of sales. But right now, that's not a very encouraging sign. And certainly if we go down a line, the other expenses, as I mentioned, have more than doubled. So it's more than 100% increase, and continuing to go down. All of these things, as we march down, are increasing at a faster rate than our sales, and so that ultimately dictates, and it means that the net income has to go down. It has to be decreasing because our expenses are increasing at such a rapidly higher rate than our sales are. So again, total expenses, if we just keep going down, we're going to have these big increases. EBIT is down by a huge amount. Interest expense, now this is perhaps tied to, well, not perhaps, this is definitely tied to something else going on. Interest expense isn't necessarily running the company, it's about the debt we've taken on. So apparently the debt burden has gone up considerably over the past year. Perhaps we had to buy a whole lot more property, plant, and equipment, a whole lot more fixed assets to support our sales growth. And in order to finance that, we had to borrow money. So we've got things kind of going haywire all over the place here. Moving on down to pre-tax earnings. Those have gone down by 200%. Taxes, this is a nice thing. Taxes have gone down as well. We have saved money in taxes. Last year we had to pay $58,000. This year we have a tax credit that basically a loss carry forward perhaps that we could use in the future. We are not having to pay that. That's basically a refund from Uncle Sam of $63,000. So we've saved a lot in taxes, but in order to do that, you had to have a huge change in net income. In this case, the net income went down by 208% as well. So even though we had a nice increase in sales, we had some very negative changes going on elsewhere in the income statement, which ultimately led to a huge decrease in net income. So let's move on in the slideshow and wrap this thing up with this particular slide. And there's going to be some information that's not in the income statement itself. So, and this is part of the reason why we want to look at the financial statements in a holistic fashion. We're going to start very soon here incorporating information from the balance sheet, the income statement, the statement of cash flows, and the statement of equity. So we're going to be looking at all of these things in conjunction. But the income statement itself isn't going to give us some important information. Income statements are based on accrual accounting, so we're going to miss out on some cash-based details. We won't necessarily see how revenue was generated, where or how expenses were paid, or when they were paid. Again, if we have accrued expenses, that means we owe the money, but we haven't necessarily paid it yet. And so we don't know when those expenses are going to be paid. And we also don't know how our earnings are being used. So none of that flows through or comes out in looking at the income statement. So we're going to be, again, incorporating other statements, particularly the statement of cash flows is going to be very informative. It kind of brings in information from both the income statement and the balance sheet and starts to help us get a holistic picture of the company, what's going on with it, and some of the decisions that managers can make with respect to running the company. So that is the last video here on the income statement. We're going to wrap this up here, and we'll see you next time.
चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 सारे इश्क की छाँव चल छैया छैया सारे इश्क की छाँव चल छैया पाँव जन्नत चले चल छैया छैया पाँव जन्नत चले चल छैया चल छैया 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 वो यार है जो खुशबू की तरह जिसकी जुबां उर्दू की तरह मेरी शाम रात मेरी कायनात वो यार मेरा सैया सैया चल छैया 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 चल छैया छैया छैया